Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Monday edition of A Daily Walk. I hope that you had a wonderful weekend. Prayerfully, you joined with your church family, studied the Word, worshiped the Lord, and now you're going into a brand new week. Well, you're not going alone. The Bible says that the Lord goes with you. He has the name Emmanuel, God with us. Not only is He with you, but He's in you, and He goes before you. He's all around you. Today, we pick up Mark's Gospel, chapter 2, right towards the end, beginning in verse 23, if you'd follow along with me. It says, "Now it happened when He went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. And as they went, His disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to Him, 'Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?'" Jesus and His disciples now making their way from one village to another, and it just so happened to be the Sabbath day. In fact, many things that Jesus did were recorded on the Sabbath day. And it seemed that when Jesus did something on the Sabbath, that the Pharisees were always there to criticize whatever it was that He was doing. And on this particular day, He was passing through the fields of grain. And in those days, you would have standing fields alongside of one another, and there would be a path in between for you to walk on. And as the disciples are walking, they just happen to grab hold of the top of a piece of grain. And it's interesting because I've actually tasted this before. You take it and you put it in your hand, and then you put it in your mouth, and it's almost like a gummy type substance. I will say it doesn't taste that good, but it does kind of get you through until you get to the next village, perhaps, to eat an actual meal. And so that's what they were doing. In fact, that was actually Levitically correct. You could do that according to the book of Leviticus. Now, you couldn't harvest your neighbor's grain field because, well, it belonged to your neighbor. But you could take a head of grain and just pluck it and just put a little bit in your mouth and keep walking. However, the Pharisees, when they saw that, and they were always looking for something to be critical of what Jesus was doing, they said, "They're harvesting, they're working on the Sabbath day," which is ridiculous. They weren't working. But when you're critical, when you're a critical person, you look at everything and find fault with it. And that's really what the Pharisees were doing. They weren't harvesting the grain. They were simply just taking a little bit of it in order to sustain them, and it was lawful. Well, Jesus responded to this criticism by giving a biblical example of something that had happened years earlier with King David. And Jesus said in verse 25, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry? He and those with him, how they went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and they ate the showbread, which is not lawful except for the priests. And He gave some to others who were with him." Jesus cites an example of when King David was on the run from Saul. You remember when Saul found out that David had been anointed and the people were singing his praises, that David was a threat to his throne. And so he pursued David. David fled. He lived the life of a fugitive, and he had no supplies. And so the first place that he ran to, well, was where the priests were. He went to the tabernacle, went to the place where they were at, and he asked, "Do you have anything on hand?" And what they had was, first of all, a sword. It was the sword of Goliath that David had won so many years earlier. They gave David a sword. But then David said, "Is there anything to eat?" And the only thing that they had available was something that was sacred and set apart for the priests. It was the showbread. But because David was in need, they overlooked a religious protocol in order to meet the need of the king. And Jesus is saying, in other words, hey, listen, the need takes precedent over a Sabbath regulation. And that's what He was trying to express to these Pharisees who were so critical of what He was doing, because a greater than David was in their presence. This was the Son of David, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and He and His disciples were in need. They weren't in violation. And so He cites this Old Testament example to really, I suppose, validate what they were doing. They weren't in violation. And then after this, it says, Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of Sabbath." Now, this is powerful, folks, and this would have incited the religious leaders. You remember Jesus said a moment ago, "Have you not read Like, didn't you read this before? That would have been insulting. But then Jesus said, listen, I want you to understand that the Sabbath was actually made for man. It's a day of rest. It's not a day of regulation. And the religious leaders of the day, they had added so many traditions to the Sabbath day that it made it almost impossible to rest. If you ever get a chance and you look up some of the things that they would follow as what really constituted rest, it really is almost comical to see the things that they said. But here Jesus says that now notice this, he himself is the Lord of the Sabbath. That's a big deal, because basically Jesus is saying, I'm in charge of the Sabbath. You remember when God gave the 10 Commandments to the nation of Israel, as Moses came down from the mountain and was able to let the people know what the commandments were? One of them that was specifically for the nation of Israel was remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It was a day that they were to rest. They were to commune with God. And I think it is beneficial to have a day of rest. For some people, that can't be on Saturday because they work. Maybe for you, it's on Monday. Whatever day it is, it's good to have a day of rest so that you can kind of recharge and be refreshed and be renewed in order to keep going in the rest of the week. 6 days you labor, 1 day you rest. That's a good example. And when Jesus then says that he's the Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying that those commandments that were given, I'm Lord of it. I just emphasize that to say this would have shocked the religious leaders. No wonder they were so upset. Jesus is basically calling himself God. I'm the God of the Sabbath. I'm the one that created it. I mean, that's a heavy thing to say. A couple things to take away from this little section at the end of chapter 2. First of all, are you a critical person? Do you consistently look at the faults of others and then expose them and constantly hammer on them? Or are you somebody who shows love and covers a multitude of faults? Maybe there's things that people do that you don't do, and the way they do it, you don't like it. Are you critical? Are you an encourager? There's a difference between encouragement and constructive criticism versus just straight criticism. How do you say it? Are you critical? If you are, ask the Lord to change your heart. Ask the Lord to have you look at the plank in your own eye before you seek to take the speck out of somebody else's. That's what Jesus encouraged us to do. But the second thing is, in light of this text, do you have a day of rest? And do you rest in the Lord? Do you know that Jesus ultimately is our rest? He's our rest. I find my rest in him. If you haven't, well, I encourage you, plan a day where you can just be alone with the Lord and just spend time in prayer, spend time in his word, take a walk, do something that can just kind of get your mind off all the distractions that are constantly bombarding us, and find your rest in the Lord. Well, may God bless you. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.